And we will start with the latest from Afghanistan. The United States has carried out a second airstrike in the country after the deadly Kabul airport suicide attack. The target of the US drone strike were multiple suicide bombers of ISIS who were aiming to target the airport with an explosive-laden vehicle, according to the US. A senior US official says the US military drone fired a Hellfire missile at a vehicle in a compound between two buildings. Hellfire missiles are used by the United States for special operations. It does not use an explosive warhead, which reduces the possibility of civilian casualties. The US says the missile was fired after individuals were seen loading explosives into a trunk.
Smoke rose after a blast in Kabul on Sunday. U.S. officials said an American drone strike targeted a suspected suicide bomber traveling in a vehicle to attack the city's airport. The strike is the second carried out by U.S. forces in Afghanistan after an Islamic State suicide bomber attacked the airport last week, killing 13 American troops and scores of Afghan civilians. ISIS operatives in Afghanistan are viewed as a threat by both Western forces and Taliban militants who recently took control of the country. The violence comes as the U.S. nears the August 31 deadline to pull all American forces from Afghanistan, ending a 20-year military mission. President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden visited Dover Air Base in Delaware on Sunday to honor the 13 Americans killed in the ISIS blast last week. He received the service members' remains that were being flown back to the United States. Biden pledged to end America's longest war, but the rapid and chaotic withdrawal has drawn criticism. The United States and allies have taken about 114,400 people, foreign nationals and vulnerable Afghans, out of the country in the past 2 weeks. Philadelphia's International Airport welcomed Afghan refugees over the weekend. The city's mayor greeted the arrivals, who received COVID-19 tests and welcome packages of water, food, toiletries, and diapers. Many will stay in Philadelphia and surrounding areas. Others are fleeing overland. An Iranian health official said over 1,000 people a day were coming through the Dogarun crossing. The United Nations Refugee Agency said last week up to 500,000 Afghans could flee their homeland by year-end.
I'm standing at the strike site, which the U.S. has claimed that they had targeted an ISK terrorist. I've been here. This is the car that was targeted. It's literally shredded into pieces. We're seeing pretty gritty scenes, not definable in words, because the smell of blood. Even now, we've seen human flesh all over the place. The house has been greatly damaged. If my camera person can show you as well, this was the interior of the car. These are the remnants of the rocket that has been fired on the car. The CENTCOM says that while they are assessing the damage, but they have claimed that it was an ISK terror-linked car. The family over here has denied. I spoke to the brother of the person who has lost his life. There are 10 people who have been killed in this strike, in this U.S. drone strike, and the family says that they demand justice. They have outrightly denied any links with the IS, contrary to how it has been reported or claimed, and they say that these were innocent civilians. This is what the family has maintained. There were children among them. 10 civilian casualties, as what the locals have been telling us, and they've also maintained that there was no secondary explosion. There was only one explosion that took place because of the rocket that had hit the car.
As we've been hearing, US President Joe Biden has paid tribute to the military personnel killed in the suicide bomb attack at Kabul airport. 13 US soldiers were killed in the deadly attack by the Afghan affiliate of the Islamic State, ISIS-K. The ISIS suicide bomber had targeted the US-led evacuation process. The bombing took place outside Kabul airport, where thousands of civilians were trying to flee from the Taliban-captured Afghanistan. The president, along with his wife, has visited the Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, where the family members of slain troops were present. Biden vowed to hunt down the perpetrators of the terror attack. Joe Biden is facing immense pressure from the international community over the chaotic withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. The suicide attack is believed to be the worst bombings targeting US troops in Afghanistan since 2011. Several organisations have condemned the suicide attack, including the United Nations and NATO. Meanwhile, the Taliban claim the attack took place where the US military was in control. And we are now just a few hours away from the US and NATO forces finally exiting Afghanistan after completing airlift operations. Countries now face a tough question. What next for the country? The 5 permanent members of the United Nations will hold an emergency meeting later to chalk out their future strategy. What we know so far is that French President Emmanuel Macron will propose the creation of a safe zone in Kabul. It would ensure the continuation of humanitarian operations to protect people leaving the country. But with the creation of such a safe zone, global powers would also be able to maintain pressure on the Taliban. Emmanuel Macron says that France is holding pre-discussions with the Taliban about the humanitarian situation in the country. He's clarified that this doesn't mean France is recognising the Taliban as a government. The French president's outlined 3 key areas which he says the Taliban must follow.
Let's be clear, those who are in control of Kabul and the territory of Afghanistan are the Taliban. It doesn't imply that we will recognize them because we have laid out conditions. The first thing is for the Taliban to abide by the humanitarian law and to protect all of those who have the right to be protected by asylum. The second thing is that they must be very clear with all terrorist groups. If they join with terrorist groups in the region, obviously that will be unacceptable to us. The third thing is respect of human rights, our values, in particular the dignity of Afghan women.
Meanwhile, the United States will hold a virtual ministerial meeting on Afghanistan with countries like Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, Turkey and Qatar, along with the European Union and the NATO military alliance as well. The participants will discuss an aligned approach for the days ahead. Later in the day, Blinken will also be speaking on American efforts since August the 14th. Remember, a day ahead of the troop pull-out deadline, Antony Blinken said that only 250 US citizens are left to be evacuated from Afghanistan. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan assured Americans who've decided to stay beyond the deadline will not be stuck in Afghanistan, and says the US does have a mechanism to get them out. Most countries have completed their evacuation operations. 100 nations have issued a joint statement citing that the Taliban has vowed to allow continued departures even after the US troop withdrawal deadline. China and Russia, however, were not among the signatories to the document. China refused to sign the joint statement, and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has told US Secretary of State Antony Blinken in a phone call that the international community should engage with Afghanistan's new Taliban rulers and positively guide them. China wants Washington to work with the international community to provide economic and humanitarian aid to Afghanistan and to help the new government run functions normally. China wants the maintenance of social stability and stopping the currency from depreciating. India was also not part of the document issued by the 100 countries. India's still deliberating a wait-and-watch policy on Afghanistan, at least until there is clarity on any entity forming a government in Kabul. A video of an Afghan anchor being surrounded by armed Taliban men inside a news studio has gone viral. The frightened anchor can be seen parroting a Taliban message on air. The 42-second videos raised a lot of questions about the Taliban's promises of a free media in Afghanistan, and it's emerged at a time when there are multiple reports of journalists being attacked in the country since the Taliban have taken over.
متحدینو وطن اشغال کړي وو د وحشت په ځای ایجاد کړي وانه مجاهد ورستر هغه په مقابل کې جهاد وکړو.
It seems like this Afghan TV network has gone through a complete overhaul. It's called the Peace Studio, and ironically, the anchor of the new show was surrounded by 8 armed Taliban fighters. A 42-second video from the Peace Studio's new show has gone viral. A news anchor, visibly petrified, was made to sing praises of the Taliban with armed men behind him. Don't be afraid. These were the words of the terrified anchor as the studio was flanked by armed men. A message of peace, a message of fear-free Afghanistan with armed Talibs in the background. On the program called Pardaz, Taliban members reportedly stormed the station and forced the anchor to speak to them. According to reports, the TV presenter was also asked to speak about the collapse of the Ghani government.
آقای غنی از افغانستان فرار کرده و در افغانستان عده‌ای که منتقد اشرف غنی هستند میگویند که
On August 17th, in their first briefing after capturing Kabul, the Taliban promised media freedom. The promise is already on test as Afghan journalists begin an uncertain chapter under Taliban rule. A few days ago, an Afghan reporter working with Tolu News and a cameraman were thrashed by the Taliban in Kabul while they were reporting. Last week, German public broadcaster Deutsche Welle said a relative of one of its journalists was killed by the Taliban fighters. It also said that the Taliban were conducting a house-to-house search for the journalist. Deutsche Welle said that homes of 3 other journalists were also raided. Earlier this month, Argand, a female Afghan anchor, made history by interviewing a senior Taliban leader on air. 2 days later, she interviewed Malala Yousafzai. Soon, Argand's work was put on hold. Ultimately, she fled her country like a million others, citing the dangers that many Afghan journalists face under the Taliban rule. Taliban came to power with a conciliatory tone. They made several promises and assured citizens of a safe Afghanistan. But the group seems to have already reneged on many of them, including free media. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
The Taliban have shot dead a renowned Afghan folk singer in the country's northeastern Baghlan province. Fawad Andrabi was allegedly dragged out of his home and killed by Taliban fighters. According to reports, the Taliban had previously come to his home, searched it and even had tea with the musician. He played the gichak and sang traditional songs about his birthplace, his people and Afghanistan. A video circulating online shows Andrabi sitting on a rug and performing with the mountains behind. In July, the Taliban also killed comedian Nazar Mohammed, popularly known as Kashar Zwan, in the Kandahar province. The comedian was taken out of his home and killed by unidentified gunmen. The Taliban believe music to be sinful in Islam. While in power in Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001, the Taliban permitted religious singing but banned other forms of music because it was seen as a distraction to the Islamic way of life. While the Taliban assumed power with the promise of a less brutal rule this time around, its re-emergence has been marked by reports of attacks on journalists, minorities and those believed to have worked with foreign forces. Some women have reportedly been barred from workplaces, despite the Taliban's claims that they would be allowed to study and work. Away from Afghanistan now, and in a troubling development potentially, the United Nations Atomic Energy Agency has said that North Korea appears to have restarted its plutonium-producing reprocessing reactor, a possible sign that Pyongyang is expanding its banned weapons program. This development on the 5-megawatt reactor in Yongbyon, which is North Korea's main nuclear complex, comes as talks on the nuclear issue between Pyongyang and Washington remain at a standstill.
North Korea could soon be resuming production of its nuclear weapons. In its annual report dated Friday, the International Atomic Energy Agency said Pyongyang appeared to have restarted a nuclear reactor believed to have once produced plutonium for the country's nuclear arsenal. It said in its report that for 2.5 years, there had been no indications of that reactor's operation at Yongbyon, a complex at the heart of Pyongyang's nuclear program, until July. It added that the apparent restart of the reactor coincides with indications of activity at a nearby uranium mine and plant. That comes after the IAEA said there had been signs at Yongbyon of possible reprocessing work to separate plutonium from spent reactor fuel earlier this year. The IAEA, which is the UN's atomic watchdog, called the new indications deeply troubling. It monitors North Korea from afar, largely through satellite imagery, after its inspectors were expelled by Pyongyang in 2009.
Let's take you now to a lesser-known museum in a small town west of Russia. The museum in Nitva is home to 5,000 kinds of spoons from 80 different countries. Let's take a look inside Russia's cutlery heaven.
Did you know that there was a time when aluminum was more expensive than gold? Did you know that seashells were the early prototypes for spoons in the 18th century? And did you know that there's a small town in Russia that houses all of these treasures, where you can learn about the genesis of a spoon? Well, if you didn't, you're in the right place. The Russian town of Nitva is home to a spoon museum, a museum that has 5,000 different types of spoons from 80 different countries.
For us, it is a unique museum because it is being created by all visitors of the museum. Everyone who came to us once tries to bring something interesting to us on their next visit. Very many spoons were given to us by well-known people who, having visited the museum, were inspired by the theme and brought spoons from everywhere.
This everyday household item takes center stage here. Ornately decorated displays fashioned in line with the lavish Rococo design of the 18th century. The Nitva Spoon Museum charts the genesis and the evolution of spoons designs.
The production output was so small while the investments into it were so big that aluminium was more expensive than gold. The first aluminium cutlery was made by a jeweler for the French Emperor Napoleon III. At one of the dinners, his family was using the aluminium spoons with pride, while the courtiers, enviously looking at them, used silver ones and gold-plated.
The museum opened in 2003 as part of the Nitva Museum of Local History. The oldest spoons at the museum date back to the period between 7 and 9 AD. From scoops to souvenirs to cutlery used during the World Wars, the Nitva Museum boasts a varied display of cutlery donated to the museum by its visitors.
I have a spoon at home of my father who went through the whole war, and the spoon looks like a trophy. As the guide told us, everybody has his or her personal spoon at war, and this spoon had the surname scratched on it, Belobrov.
A spoon is probably the smallest and the most straightforward receptacle. But don't be fooled. They, in fact, take up to 40 technological processes to produce. You heard it right. 40. Visitors to the museum can learn all about the process and production of spoons here. You'd think that a museum for an item like a spoon may not get a lot of footfalls. But you've been mistaken, because the Nitva Museum gets about 15,000 visitors annually. The more you know. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.